Good evening. My name is Jen Cort, and I am here to talk about what's different for kids today. I'm really looking forward to our having some time together. We have four constructs that we're going to go through, and I encourage you to ask questions. I'll be following along on the Facebook feed and answering questions as we go through, and definitely after each construct, I want to hear what your thoughts are. So, just a little bit about me and what I do. I am a clinical social worker, so I'm trained as a therapist. I've been a counselor in lower, middle, and upper schools, and I've been an assistant principal of a lower school, principal of a middle school, senior administrator, and for the last 5 years, I've been a consultant working around the country with schools, primarily focusing on equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice. So, one of the things that I try to always talk about is time and energy. And this will help us to really be thinking about what it is that's different for kids today. So, we talk about time with kids from way before the human brain can understand them. Many of us have messages for our kids about time. Even when they're babies, we might say it's time to go to bed, it's time to brush your teeth, maybe a time out, and then we have these really weird messages about time as we go along. We rarely are walking around kind of saying to kids, I had so much time today, and we don't have these really positive messages about them. Then you get to when they do understand time, which is around 7, 8, 9, that early elementary school age. They have this already negative relationship to it. But what kids do understand from a really young age is energy. I was sitting next to a toddler on a plane. He was pre-verbal. I don't even know if he was really toddler. He had a few words that he used. And his mom had packed everything. She was really excited that she had thought of every single bag and had labeled it properly. But she hadn't charged the iPad. And though he was not verbal, he was able to indicate to her and to me his complete frustration that the iPad had not been charged. So, the reason why these two things are so important is because if we help kids to think about their energy allocation, the same way we help them think about their time management, we can really build together for them their ability to listen to themselves and to expect the spaces around them to accommodate them. So, one of the things we know takes a lot of energy for kids and for adults is when they have to code switch, when they have to leave a part of themselves at the door and talk differently, walk differently, dress differently, sorry, I'm learning this, anything along those lines so that they're not able to be their full and complete selves. Then they have to code switch, and code switching takes a lot of energy for kids, which means that they are being asked to grapple with the same tasks as other kids, but with less energy available to them. And I'd also point out, we're talking about what's different for kids today, but code switching is just as true for adults. So let's move into hearing about the four constructs. The first one has to do with athletics, the second is devices, thirdly is development, and fourthly is diversity. And I'm just going to dive right in. Athletics, I wrote an article about this once, and somebody asked me if I had an issue with athletics. I don't have an issue with athletics at all. I have an issue with our relationship to athletics. And just as a case in point, the young swimmer there that you see is one of my kids who's a college level athlete. So we've been in this world for a long time, but I've watched the relationship really change. About 10 years ago, we noticed that kids started majoring in sports as young as 7 or 8. And in fact, they were encouraged to do so and still are encouraged to do so. And so, what happens with that is that there's an intertwining of identity and athletics. So, let's think about this. If you're 7 or 8 and you are majoring in a sport, one sport, and you're playing that sport all year long, and sometimes two teams at a time, what happens to your identity when you can't do it the same way, or you don't like it, or you get injured? And so now who are you? So I think back to when I first became a school counselor almost 30 years ago, and I used to ask my students, what do you do in your spare time? What do you like to do? What are you interested in? What sports? Notice the multiple sports. Are you interested in, or even are you interested at all? Now the counselors I supervise talk about kids playing a sport and that they are asking the question, what sport do you play? So we're also seeing that in addition to it being multiple seasons, it's often multiple teams. And the research shows that by middle school, most kids are playing their sport in school and multiple seasons outside of school. So the goal used to be, about 15 years ago, to be a good enough athlete to make travel teams. But I'm curious what viewers on this show think about who gets left out of travel teams, who is not included. Please put your questions and comments in the chats and in the chat part, and we'll follow along. So what happened with travel teams, though, is that we found that we just created more travel teams. So now we have gone from the goal being to make these travel teams to that there are just more travel teams available. We also see an increased number of sports-related injuries because of overuse, because the body is not meant to be moving the way they have to do the same sport over and over again. And I was asked to talk with some orthopedic surgeons. I was really surprised to be asked because I thought do they know what I do? And when I got there, we started a conversation. They had read something I had written about athletics, and we started a conversation, and they shared with me their sadness and concern with how often parents are posed with the question, does your child have surgery or do they stop playing this sport? And over again, parents are choosing the surgery. So I wonder, what does that do to the identity of that child? And what does that say to them? And also, one of the things they said is that for most cases, most of the overuse injuries, by stopping for a season or two, they are able to repair those injuries in their bodies. And many athletic directors that I work with say that they actually come back as better engaged and more fully interested because they were away from it for a while. We also see that there's a lot of pressure to get college level scholarships. And now remember that the shift really happened about 10 to 12 years ago. So those kids are going to college soon, if not already there. But the college money has not increased with the number of kids who are coming. So with this pressure to get the college level scholarships, we are going to find that the scholarships are going to be even less available than they have been. And then we have something where some of my students mentioned that I had one of my students tell me that he had conversations with parents that sounded like this. When they're on the sidelines, the kids are saying, the parents are like so excited, and they say things like, we won the game and we're going to champs and all these other things, to which I often say, we brought bug spray and maybe snacks. We didn't do anything. But the we message in it is very tied together with parents. And then the part that gets lost is where's the we when we lose? So the language shifts a little bit, but it shifts in a really important way. It often sounds like, I'm so sorry you lost, or better luck next time, sending the unintentional message to our kids that we're with them when they're winning and we're not when they're losing. And I also, one other factor along these lines on a personal note, we're empty nesters now in my house, and I was talking with a friend of mine who's also an empty nester, and she was commenting on how she missed her social life. And as we talked more, I then started asking other friends of mine who found the same thing, that parents' social lives are often so tied into their child's sports. And so all of this, to me, I think some things we can be doing as people who are invested in student lives, we can be helping kids think about, what are you passionate about? Help them realize that the avenue is not only through sports, because there's so many kids who cannot play or don't want to, and then they feel like they're stuck. Who are they and where do they fit in? We can also help parents balance out their messages, and we parents can listen to the language we're using to let our kids know that we're really with them no matter what. So that's the first construct, and I'm going to look to Facebook now and see if we can find some questions. Oh, thank you for the kind comments. I really appreciate all the great feedback. So one question that just came through through text to me was, what are some of the messages that we could be telling our little kids about what it is that they're that they're interested in when it comes to sports? And this is really where I think families need to look at what is their value. If the value is physical activity and being a team member, learning to win well, learning to lose well, then that doesn't matter what sport it's tied to, because it could be tied to any sport. The other is to have conversations with kids about, as I said earlier, what does it mean to be passionate about something? That doesn't mean we feel great about it all the time, because that's really not possible. But when we feel passionate about it, when we are having a hard time, we are able to push through that hard time because we know on the other side that we're going to get the kind of feedback that we're seeking. So those are some things we can be doing. Also, really helping kids to be thinking about their sleep hygiene and what does it mean to have good sleep hygiene, so that they're making sure that their bodies are being taken care of. And I do work with a lot of coaches and athletic directors, and they frequently talk about not only do kids seem to come back liking their sport even more after they've taken time off to recover, but also one of the really nice things about teaching about switching sports is it creates the opportunity for kids to do one of the beautiful things about what sports are intended to do: to begin something, to end something, to welcome new people, to talk about how you cheer each other on and how you give feedback. All the things that sports are really meant to be really wonderful at. And so if we can help them to do that, that would be a lovely thing. I noticed over the years as a swim parent, the only time I knew that the swim season began and end was because I wrote a new check. It wasn't like when they were little and the season would end and we'd have kind of the end of the season party and then we'd look for a new sport, and it just kind of rolls from one to the other. So I'm looking forward to us helping our kids to have a more robust relationship with what they can do athletically. All right, moving on. We're going to come back to devices a couple of times, but I just want to give us a little bit of grounding, mostly in terms of what students tell me. I have the privilege of working with thousands of kids a year, and many of them are kind enough to let me survey them, to ask their opinion, to get their feedback. And so everything we're going to talk about right now comes from information I've gotten through research, but also directly through listening to my students. So when we think about devices, many schools still have kind of the relationship with them, though I'm really curious how this is going to change with the COVID-19 virus. That there's something that we need to be wary of or concerned about. And now we're really flipping the paradigm on the language around devices. So I'm really curious about how that's going to work out. But one thing that we know with devices is they are increasingly the educational and informational source for everybody. I was in the grocery store the other day and I heard a young person say to his mom that he was looking for something that he wanted to cook, and he stopped in the middle of the aisle to look it up. His mom got annoyed with him and said, "Don't text right now." He wasn't texting, he was looking up the recipe and looking up the ingredients to see if the ingredients worked in everyone in his house. Another thing with devices is that our devices are really responsive to search algorithms. So what I mean by this is, it used to be if you looked something up on your computer and you found a list at the top, then you might scroll through for more pages. Now it's down to, some studies show only 3% click after the first one, meaning that the information that's on the first page is often given more credibility and more importance. Whether it's true or not doesn't matter, because it really shows up on the first page because the algorithm made it so that that happened. And an example of this would be, I have, as I said, we're empty nesters now, and I could have sent my kids off to school with an emoji bedroom. I didn't, but I could have. And just a few years ago, the word emoji didn't exist, but they were created. People wanted to know what they were, and so people researched them. And that word, the word emoji, then became recognized in the lexicon of our country and in all of society, many societies. And it moved into being an official word of the year. You could have an emoji birthday party, an emoji movie, all these things. And so this happens regularly. And one of the things that's really important for parents and educators to know is that when things happen for in our students' lives or in society, and we are not responding to them, well, what kids do is they go back to the educational and informational source and they look it up. So I have a student who told me that his school did not want to talk to him about the incident that happened in Charlottesville. And so he looked up the video of the car crash and Heather Heyer's death on YouTube and watched it on loop. I have another student who asked his mom what it meant to be gay, and she told him that he was too young. So he asked his Alexa, which is a whole other host of problems. I can't imagine that was a value-based conversation. And the way that I found out that happened was I was talking about gendered messages in society. This was a 4th grade class. And I said that I was concerned because Alexa and Siri are gendered female names. And I was concerned about kids just kind of walking around and adults walking around saying, Alexa, tell me this. Siri, put on this music. And I worried about what kind of narrative and subtext it was creating that these 2 female gendered names were being called out regularly. And then he explained to me that his Alexa was actually a great thing. His Alexa had explained to him what it meant to be gay, which of course had me concerned on a whole other level. Another thing that we think about when we think about our devices is that increasingly they are not separated from the person. As I talk to you right now, I have a laptop in front of me, I have an iPad in front of me, and I have my phone in front of me. And I'm checking all 3. I could say to myself, I'm doing so because I want to be able to be responsive to you all, and that's definitely true, but it's also become just such a habit. Middle schoolers, I surveyed 250 middle schoolers, and they told me that they feel that there's a different relationship, a different set of rules between middle schoolers and adults. Some of the things they talked about were that we give messages of, don't post pictures of somebody without their permission, and yet they get onto our school's social media or their parents' social media, and they see many images of themselves they didn't give consent for. So if you are somebody who has done that, that's not a bad thing. It's simply a thing that gives us an opportunity to have a conversation with our kids so that we can have, that's a consent conversation. And I really want them to have consent conversations before my college students have consent conversations. So I want them to have those early and frequently. And I'd love if schools and parents would sit down with kids and say, I've been posting pictures of you and I hadn't asked your permission, and I just want to check with you and see how you feel. Other inconsistencies that kids mentioned were things along the lines of saying, don't text and drive when you drive a car, but how many adults are checking their phones at stoplights? And when I heard that, I thought, at first I became very righteous. I've never done that. And then I realized that I absolutely have. And now I'm really aware how often when I'm at stop signs and stoplights, how often there's honking because somebody's checking their device. So other things kids have said is, please don't tell us not to use our device at the table, but then you use it. Please don't tell us that you don't want us to pick up our phone as soon as we leave class, but then we see you walking around on your phone. Just helping them to have balance with it. Because on the other hand, one of the things that I found in that survey was how many of my students were talking about that they needed their device. They needed it for different things, including one of my students who's the only openly gay person at her school. And we found some students at other schools who are also openly gay, and we set them up in a little chat so that she doesn't feel completely alone. So I think the relationship around devices is really going to change. It's going to have to change, especially with what we're doing in so many schools right now with devices. And we're going to come back to devices when we talk about development. But I'm wondering if anyone has any questions or thoughts on the conversation around devices. Oh, here's a good one. This one comes to me from Paula, who texted me saying, what kind of language do parents use about their devices on a regular basis? And one of the things that I think is interesting is this is just kids' feedback. I don't say just in terms of lack of importance. I say just because I didn't ask adults. But they really describe feeling frequently that they are not being supported for having their device and for what their device does for them, and that they feel criticized about it a lot. So I think we adults need to look at our own narrative around our devices. What are we saying? What are we doing? And most importantly of all, what are we modeling? I think it's a wonderful thing to say to our children on any given day. Wow, I realized I checked my screen and how often I've been on my screen today. And I want to just give us a little inflection in terms of language. Many people, kids too, use the word phone, but very few young people use their phone to actually make calls. And when they do, they're mostly incoming. So thinking about it as a device and an informational source may be another way for us to be thinking about this. All right, we're going to move on to development. So, and we're going to come back, connect this to devices. So the physical changes of adolescence are beginning earlier than they have before. And we don't know why. There's some studies being done, all kinds of studies being done on whether or not it has to do with nutrition or chemicals. I have a friend who's an anthropologist who talks about how the human body has changed so much over the years. And he thinks maybe that's part of it. I don't know. But what I do know is that it's happening earlier. I know this because of several different reasons. One, just in my own little study of the world. When I first became a counselor, as I said, almost 30 years ago, I had one fifth grade girl who had begun menstruation. And now the counselors that I supervise describe third and fourth grade and fifth grade as being very common starting points. And yet we still find that the education, the conversation, which really needs to be multiple conversations, is happening later than it does, it's happening around the same time as it did before. So there's still a lot of schools and parents and grandparents and caregivers who are talking about having their information starting around sixth grade. And yet we know that that's actually too late for a lot of kids. And if it's not too late for those kids, leaves them out of information where they may have development start later, but their friends do not. And so we need them to have resources. I always advise that that parents buy books or go to the library and get books, download. There's a lot of free downloadable books now that we can use. There's great resources that if you check my Pinterest page, I'm happy to share with you on how to talk to our kids. So that the physical changes are happening earlier. And I've done a study of the health curriculum as much as I could find for the last 40 years in different states. And what I can't find is any references to the chemical changes which precede the physical changes. So thinking about this for a moment. The physical changes of adolescence used to begin about a year before our same gender parent, which was great if you knew that parent and they wanted to talk to you about it. Now it's the numbers are all over the place, but I'd say about average 18 months before. And the chemical changes precede the physical changes by about another 12 to 15 months. So this puts many of our second graders going through the chemical changes of pre-adolescence, and we need to be supporting them so that we're not waiting until their bodies show us something, but rather we're pre-planning with them. Because if you think about devices for a moment and put this together with development, throughout their ages and stages, we pre-plan with them. We tell them, you're going to learn to tie your shoes, and then we show them how to tie their shoes. And hopefully we're not frustrated with them when they don't get it on the first time, but we're usually pretty patient and willing to work through it with them. Then they learn how to tie their shoes and we move on to something else. So we're very much in partnership with them. We pre-plan, we pre-stage for them. And then when they do things, think about, like, I was watching kids on the monkey bars today, and I saw a parent kind of holding a child up and helping them on the monkey bars. And then I saw a little bit of an older child who got a few across, and then another child who got even further. all of which was celebrated and documented by the parent who had their phone there. So they go through this expectation that we're going to meet them where we are, that where they are, we're going to help them have the information they need. We're going to be thinking through with things with them. We're going to celebrate and document it. And hopefully we're asking consent to put it on our social media. At least we are now. And but we don't about these physical changes. And the thing is that the absence of information often feels like a secret. And we usually make it up, and we make it up in our more insecure ways. So I'm really hoping teachers and parents will help kids to be thinking about how their bodies, their brains, their hearts, their everything is going to change, and that we, the adults, are with them. Another part that is really different, and actually I have to say I'm a little biased about this because I'm not sure how different it really is, but the part of the brain that's responsible for impulse control and decision making, we now have research that moves us from, it used to be, we thought it was done at 18 years. That's why many of the laws in this country reflect 18 years. And then we thought 21. Now it's mid-20s. And the reason why I wanted to focus on that in this section is because I'm really hoping schools and parents can have different conversations around what partnered parenting looks like as kids grow up. So what I dream of is that our students, our parents are saying to their kids, you know, we make the decisions when you're really little, then we're going to make some decisions together, then you're going to make some decisions, and I am here with you. We're going to partner together, and we're going to, as you grow and change, what that looks like is going to meet you where you are, but I'm still with you, partnering with you until your mid-20s. I don't want kids to hear that message for the first time when they go off to college, because it can often feel like a consequence or like a statement of their inability rather than I'm just with you. And I should also say here, please, if you know anybody who's in their mid-20s, please don't say anything to them about how their brain isn't complete. But please also understand that that is part of the construction of what's happening. And as I was saying, the educational practices for talking about these timelines and changes is still happening later on. Many schools that I talked to said that they do some pre-framing conversations in elementary or lower school, but the bulk of it is in middle school. And those conversations are really important in middle school, but the what your body's going to go through needs to happen earlier. So I'm hoping parents and teachers will embrace that. And I'm wondering if anyone has any questions about what we know about the developmental differences of kids today. I'm getting a lot of questions popping up through Twitter and text, so thank you. One of the questions has to do with, do we know why? And I shared a little bit about that, but the truth is we really don't know why. And there are a lot of theories. I think with these kinds of things, we always have to look at who's doing the research, who's funding the research. But whether we know why or not, it's still something that we need to be responding to for our kids. All right, so just a little bit of an example of how different things are. So if you look at, this is my son a week before he started middle school on the left. Excuse me. And here he is right after finishing on the right. The thing that's important here is to know that while, excuse me, while we may be talking to the person on the right, the person on the left is the one who's often listening to us. And it's helpful to be thinking about that because these are just an example of the middle school years. So the middle school person grows and changes more than at any other time than except from conception to age 2. So they go from cells to thinking, talking, walking, moving, people with real personalities. And the only other time they change that much is in the middle school years. So I found these two pictures and just wanted to show you how dramatic it happens, because I knew that was happening, of course, as I watched him through the years, but I didn't know it in the way that I did when I saw the pictures. All right, so let's move on to diversity. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. The conversations around this are really different for kids today. So, for example, when schools call me and they say that they're focusing on diversity, or they say we have a lot of diversity here, what they're usually referring to is we have some racial diversity in our student body. They're not referring to all the identifiers that kids are. So, what this means is that diversity has really become about the numbers. And the numbers are so important that we can't ignore them. Sorry, excuse me. So the numbers are as important for our students as they are for our teachers. The goal, of course, should be that our teaching staff, meaning everybody who works in the school, should mirror the students. But that's not the only conversation anymore. Now we're also really talking about inclusion. And inclusion doesn't just mean, is there space for me in your school? Inclusion means, can I feel like I belong in the school? Can I show up as my whole self? Do I have to code switch to be there? So I think about inclusion and belonging together. But then we also think about equity. So equity is not equality. Equality is everyone gets the same thing. Equity is everyone gets what they need. And really focusing on helping kids, if you think back to the time and energy conversation before, the more that they're able to articulate what they need, the better able they will be to be able to think about how it is to ask for what they need. And so we are better able to respond to them. So that needs to be an adult and student conversation. And then I focus on justice. So a lot of people who do the work that I do, they talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion. They might say EDI or DEI. I have the justice, and I do this for several reasons. I'm a Quaker. Justice is really important to us. I'm a social worker, also very important to us. And I was raised by hippies on a commune. And so social justice was something that they always talked to us about. So the thing that I love about thinking about justice is it's the access point for my students. My students want to break down the barriers between groups. And that's what justice is. So if we think about this in a different way, I used to always say equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice. And then I had an adult in one of my workshops say something that a student had said in one of my workshops, that we should be focusing on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So JEDI. Because in order to have justice, you have to care about equity. You have to be ever mindful of the numbers in diversity, and you have to be making sure that everyone feels included and that they belong. I know the Jedi are somewhat problematic, but I'm always looking for ways to access the conversation with my students. So when I talked about this idea of saying Jedi, one of my students said that he was going to do his capstone project, his 8th grade capstone project, on how the Jedi were actually diversity practitioners. His English teacher was excited because he hadn't been interested in his capstone project at all to that point. Well, he wrote his paper on how the Jedi were actually diversity practitioners and did very well on his paper. And then I went back this year, and his sister, who was then in 6th grade, now in 8th grade, is doing her capstone project on how he was wrong. And both are fine with me because they're talking about and thinking about what does justice, equity, diversity, inclusion look like in our schools. So for many schools and for many adults, we have this relationship with these conversations that are often very charged and slightly defensive. So I'm a white person, and about 10 years ago or so, if somebody had said to me, "You're very biased," I would also think that they were saying I was very racist. And then I'd kind of want to say in my head, and maybe to them, "No, I'm a good person and I'm not racist, so therefore I can't be biased." Now we know I'm a person, therefore I'm biased. The good and bad only comes up when I know that and I choose to do nothing about it. And that's different for kids today because they talk about it in a different way. But they also talk about some of the things that I found in my study of the last 100 years. So I've done a study of the social movements of the last 100 years, and there have been many over the years. But in the last 20 years, so for kids today, in the last 20 years, we have seen social changes, massive movements hitting on almost every one of the major social identifiers. So just to go through this timeline, kids born in 2000, and now I'm assuming memory is fixed around 4 or 5, that we have snapshot memories of before 4 or 5, but we don't have fluid memories. So kids born in 2000, they don't remember before 9/11, so they've grown up with Islamophobia as part of the background narrative of their entire lives. They don't remember before not only cell phones, but before smartphones. Kids born in 2001 are the first to have had the United States at war for their entire lives. So when I heard that, I then went and talked to military recruiters and asked them, do you notice a difference? And they talked about feeling a more laissez-faire attitude about war because it's just part of what's always been in their background. Kids born in 2004 will not remember a time before having a black president. And of course, President Obama does not see himself as a black man. He's a multiracial man, but he understands that's how the world sees him. So that's why I'm using that language here. Kids born in 2010, so our 10 and unders, they have a very different relationship to gender, which I'm going to talk about a little bit when I get to the 2018. But we know this because the 10 and unders are almost always researched a lot. You might have gathered, I'm really interested in research. I read as much as I possibly can. And clothing companies and toy companies spend a lot of time and money researching the 10 and unders because they're trying to create brand loyalty and create items that they really like. Well, this year, Mattel, the company that makes Barbie, they had focus groups with students from the Alpha generation. And that the kids described that they wanted less binary nature to their toys, less male, female, boy, girl. They wanted toys that they could make be however they wanted them to be and whatever was on their mind. So what they did, Mattel created a Barbie called Creatable World, and it's a Barbie a doll that you can change its gender, you can change its gender expression, meaning how they dress, how they look, how they do their hair, and it sold out really quickly. And we also saw that if you look at clothing over the last couple of years, we see that more clothing is moving toward all gender type looks. So for example, I was speaking at a conference and there were many people in the room who were in their early 20s. It was a first teachers conference, and so many of them were wearing flannel and denim, which used to be very gendered fabrics, but not anymore. Well, denim not as much, but flannel for sure. So we're seeing more clothes that are meant for everybody to use. We also, now let's look at 2012. So this group is the first, they won't remember a time before #MeToo 2.0. And I have 2.0 here because Alyssa Milano, a white actress, put forward #MeToo, which really propelled the conversations around sexual harassment and sexual assault and abuse of power. It's important to know, and I always want my students to know whose voices are being left out. #MeToo was actually started by a woman of color about 7 years before that, 6 to 7 years before that. So I always want them to know, to be looking for who's left out of a conversation. Kids born in 2013 will not remember before Black Lives Matter, and they won't remember before changes in media specific to race. So in 2013, Cheerios, a cereal company, made a commercial featuring a interracial family engaged in just eating Cheerios. In fact, I think they were playing with Cheerios. And it was the first time we saw an interracial family in this way. And so what happened was people got really upset about this, and Cheerios doubled down and bought a commercial in the Super Bowl, which of course is the largest statement a company can make in terms of advertising. So now that was in 2013. Then in 2014, actually, it was just a couple months after the Super Bowl, we saw a change in media specific to sexual orientation. And in this commercial, Honey Made Graham Crackers showed 2 dads who were married and had kids, or in partnerships and had kids, eating Teddy Grahams. And people went equally bananas about that. And what happened was, now we're talking about Cheerios and Honey Grahams. And I don't know about anyone else who's watching this, but these are not conversations I had on a frequent basis, but suddenly I was. And the stock of those companies was impacted. But then what we saw is all media companies, all commercials, brand, not all, but most, branding, billboards in airports and on streets and everything changed, so that now you see all kinds of people represented in our lives and in media. And so what happened is that we saw this shift, and we're still woefully underrepresented. We have a long way to go before we are showing people in really having our media represent everybody. But it has changed significantly. And one thing you can do to test this, and I've done this a lot with my students, you can go to YouTube where they have many different commercials from the years. Find a company that was around, say, 15 years ago. Look at one of their commercials now and look at one of their commercials then. And look how different they are. When I show my students commercials from when their parents were little, or even from 10 years ago, they are amazed at how the casting is. Mostly white, heterosexual, often showing upper middle class lifestyle, and so on. So it's a good exercise to do, to look at commercials from then and now. Also in 2014, we started to see some flattening in the demographics. Up until that point, there were more white people than all people of color combined in this country, and now we're seeing some flattening, so that by 2032, we should see more people of color in this country than there are white people. So all of these are really prompting us to focus on helping our kids understand that differences are additives. They are not dividers. They're what make us strong and interesting. When we look at 2015, that was when the lawsuit was settled by the Supreme Court, making it so that it was legal for gay and lesbian couples to that lawsuit was settled so that they could be married. And so now most of the states in the country moved to make it legal to recognize gay and lesbian marriages. Interestingly, though, and very importantly, it is still legal in this country to be discriminatory against somebody because of their sexual orientation. And so that's something that a lot of my students are really surprised at, because they don't understand, because they've grown up always seeing it as something legal to have relationships be recognized. In 2016, we saw an infusion of sexual assault language into the lexicon, and this has been something that has been really challenging for many of my students, because they have the language, but they don't have the scaffolded understanding. So what that looks like is, I had a student who walked in the room, and she had grown quite a bit recently, and she had some new shoes, and she tripped and fell into the back of somebody else, and somebody from across the room said, "That's sexual assault." And so the thing is that the words are being thrown around and the understanding isn't there. What happened was, her body was in somebody else's space and their body was in her space, and that's uncomfortable, but it is not sexual assault. And I want them to have those real words. Many kids say that adults are not talking to them about what that means. So if you're watching this and you're interested in what can you do to help kids navigate these, please help them to have real conversations. Also in 2017, we saw the Women's Movement 2.0. It should actually be more like 200.0, but I have 2.0 because the number of times I've had students say that they were at the women's movement. And I want to remind them that the women's movement began many, 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 many years ago. And what they are participating in is an inflection point in the women's movement. Also, that happened not long before the anniversary of the right to vote. And I'm always wondering why I hear so many students saying, it's a 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote. And then I hear a lot of adults saying the same thing. But that leaves out that only white women got the right to vote 100 years ago. Women of color didn't get the right to vote until almost 40 years later. So I, again, just want my students to know who's being left out of and included in a conversation. Thinking back to devices, kids saw teenagers start an international movement with a single hashtag, March for Our Lives. So they've seen devices be used to really affect social change. They also saw Take a Knee as a form of protest, and they see that more and more and understand what that connects to, and sometimes they aren't told what it connects to, and so they're kind of making it up as they go along. So we need to be really explaining things to them in a full way. In 2018, the guidance around gender identity really changed, and transgender became a word that we really used in our lexicon. And that's because the American Pediatric Guidelines changed, where we used to have kids go through adolescence and then go through therapy, and then they could transition. But faced with that, so many kids who are transgender, meaning the gender they were identified with at birth, which is usually having to do with looking at genitalia and saying it's a boy or a girl, is not their authentic gender. So we've really changed the conversation because we recognize that so many people in the LGBTQ, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community, they have a higher rate of homelessness, of abuse, and most seriously, all of it's very serious, but critically is the number who attempt, consider, and or complete suicide. So the American Pediatric Association lifted those guidelines, and now kids can socially transition, meaning no surgery, but they could change their name, change their pronouns, maybe their gender expression. They can do that as soon as they meet the criteria of being insistent, persistent, and consistent. Meaning, this is who I am this person all the time, I need you to hear me. So we have, at the same time, the American Psychological Association removed it as a mental health issue. So we have kids who have just a lot of language and understanding, and we're seeing younger and younger kids transition, and schools struggling with how to deal with that, and parents struggling too. If you are a school who is struggling with how to support kids, please reach out. There are a lot of us who have a lot of great information to share. So it's critical that you're having these conversations. If you're a parent or caregiver or grandparent and you're wondering where your child is in all of this, please know there are phenomenal resources, many great hospitals. There's a lot of good information, but please use credible information. Click past the first page if you don't find information that's really helpful. And I am always happy to share. You can email me anytime and I will share information with you. All right, so 2019, so just last year, we saw, if you have ever been to a protest, if you've signed up for one ahead of time, they usually ask people to register. And by registering, we are keeping the data. And the people who register is not nearly the number of people who actually attend. So these are deflated numbers, in my opinion. But we saw over 40% of school-age children in the last 2 years have gone to a protest, up from, I think it was around 6%. So this means that kids are really seeing their agency, having meaning, wanting to use their voices. And again, think of how many who are not represented in those actual numbers. We also see some school districts and counties who are offering protest as a reason to miss school. As an excused absence. So it's important that adults are working with kids around what it means to use their voice and how we can support them. And Pride organizers, are the group who support the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, queer, plus community. They describe seeing many more students coming at younger ages as participants and as allies. We also saw the climate change march, which was the face of it was a young woman, Greta, who really propelled a lot of international conversations. As I said earlier, I'm always focused on who's left out, and there are many kids of color who've been doing amazing work around climate. So I always want my students to support what's happening and ask the questions of who's left out, and then follow those people. Additionally, in 2019, and this is going back again to gender identity, they them is the word was the word of the year in 2019. They them is a pronoun that could be used for an individual person who is not wanting to, or feeling led to, feeling called to use pronouns she, her, his, him, his. So they often want to use the pronouns they, them, and that has traditionally been pushed back upon as saying that it's not a pronoun that can be used for an individual person, but now it is, and I am so excited that it is. It was recognized as by Webster's as the word of the year and as a pronoun that can be used for an individual person. So the way I explain this to my students when we're talking about this is because teachers will say, what do you do if it's meant to be about a group or not? And I say, so, if you're talking about a group of people, you might say they did this, they went to the store. But if you're talking about an individual, you want to ask them, how would they describe themselves? You don't ask them to give you their pronouns. You just ask them if they're words that they want to use, because you don't want to put somebody in the position of inadvertently outing themselves. And then in 2020, we saw the candidate pool change dramatically. It's actually 2019 to 2020, but in the beginning of the Democratic candidate pool for the election of 2020, we saw many people of different ages and genders and races and sexual orientation. And that was really exciting to see. I had a lot of kids talking about how exciting it was. I also had a lot of kids talking about that they didn't think that would last. So when we think about how they're feeling so much that their voices can be seen and heard, and how they're engaged in using their agency to really affect change, and you think of March for Our Lives and protests and everything, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens as kids move toward being able to vote. And of course, they are the first group in a while to live through seeing the impeachment of a president. And so that's something that has an impact on them. And when you combine that with their ability to engage in protests, it can create some conflict for them. And I think adults are really well served in helping our kids feel like their voices matter, and that we shouldn't be silencing each other. We should be listening for learning. We should be listening for discernment and not debate. That we are creating space for people to talk about who they are and what they value, so that we are truly making it so that all their voices can be heard in ways that work for the kids in the room and the adults in the room. We don't want anyone to be talking over or for or through anyone. All right, so that brings me almost to the end of the hour. Many of these topics are discussed on my podcast. It's called Third Space with Jen Cort. The name is kind of unfortunate because actually it's Third Space with a whole bunch of people. Students and parents and teachers and grandparents and teachers, and I said teachers twice, and administrators, alumni, people who are part of trustees, people who are thinking about going into teaching, have all come into Third Space, and many more to come, to share their thoughts and their ideas and their experiences. It's on all podcast apps. It's on iTunes and was picked up by iHeartRadio, so it's internationally syndicated, so you can really get it anywhere. And the episodes are well labeled, so you can see who's talking about what and pull them for your own listening. Also, if you are somebody who's interested in hearing more, I write a lot. I'm frequently putting things out there. Most of it comes from questions students ask me, or parents or teachers, or things I'm thinking about and reading about. I'm on all of these social media channels, usually just Jen Cort. That's my email and my web address. And I'm wondering, I threw a lot of information at you in a really short amount of time. Wondering if anyone has any questions that you want us to dive into. All right. Oh, I see one that says, if you are a grandparent, how could you support your children in having these conversations with their students? And that's such a fascinating conversation. We actually have an episode on Third Space where a grandparent is in the conversation. There's a 9-year-old granddaughter, a 15-year-old teenager, a woman in her mid-30s, a woman in her 50s, a woman in her 20s, and a 72-year-old talking about gender roles and gender messages through the years. I will also say that it's the one that's my family, so I have a special place in my heart for that. I think for grandparents, and grand caretakers, I'd advise to be thinking about what is your own relationship to some of these conversations. If you look back on that timeline, what were you taught about some of these things? Were you taught anything? And if not, then I think you are in the space where we as educators are, that I'm really excited about, because so much of what I've talked about tonight are things that we didn't talk about when we were little. We were not educated around them. And so we really are in a time where kids have a lot of language and often a lot of experiences that we don't have. And at the same time, parenting and teaching has also shifted, so that we move from what's often referred to as the sage on the stage to the guide on the side, meaning I'm the teacher who had all the answers and had the book with the answers in the back of the book, and we wouldn't talk about it unless I knew the answers, to now really helping kids to listen to each other, work with each other, learn from each other, do partner projects, talk with us and teach us. And so I just think it's fascinating that we're in these two spheres have come together at the same time. The thing that I say all the time, I have a script that I use for different situations. One of the scripts that I use is I just say, I didn't talk about that when I was your age, and so I'm learning about it. And I'd love to hear what you think, what you know, what you want to know. I'd love for us to learn about it together. I'd love to learn from you, and just really sitting and listening, which is the best way for us to learn what's going on with kids in our lives and in our schools. All right, I'm going to check to see if we have any more questions. Oh my goodness, thank you for the compliments. It's really sweet. Yes. Oh, here's one. One of my students is watching. Hi, Jonathan. And he said I could say hi. He wanted to know what it is that as a mom, I think that I struggled with the most. Such a personal question. Yes, you can submit questions via feedback. Please put them in. I will gladly answer them. And if they roll through after we finish this, I will add more. So Jonathan's question was, what do I think as a mom that I most needed to learn to parent my kids around these conversations? It's a really good question. I'm hesitating, not because I don't have the answer, but because I'm wondering how many answers I can give. What I most think that I needed to learn as a mom is that my job is to always be listening. And I don't do this well all the time, but to be listening, to be learning, to be listening for the words that my kids are using and the things they're talking about that I don't know about, and then do my own education around them. To always be pushing, and as I mentioned, social justice, equity, diversity, inclusion are really important to me, and so really helping them to find spaces that they can be part of that at different stages in their lives. I think the number one thing that I've learned as a mom is that parenting's not about me. Teaching is not about me. It's about my kids and my students, and I need to get out of the way and let my students grow and learn and teach, and the same for my children as well. All right. Well, I see that we have a few people who have asked if they can ask questions later. Yes, you are welcome to. I will send them to McLean. I'm also going to put in the comments an EPUB that has a summary of all of the things that we talked about, and some tips and information for you that you can download and use. And it has some links to some articles that I've written for some journals that give even more detail and texture to these conversations. So thank you for joining me. My first time doing something like this. I appreciate you hanging in there, and I appreciate your enthusiasm, and I enjoyed it. So thank you.